Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer from Establish the Run here with another edition of a screencast looking at how I've used the Fantasy Labs optimizer to help build some of my MME lineups. A few weeks ago, after week 2, I did a tutorial / review of my lineup set for week 2, and it earned a lot of positive feedback, and I really appreciate all the feedback. We always try to adapt and adjust our content to consumer demand. So there were a lot of questions about how to use an optimizer and people who are using it for the first time. And so I set out to do a Q&A, and that's what we're doing here today, to tackle some of the issues that you might be having while using an optimizer. In my case, I'm using the Fantasy Labs optimizer this NFL season. We at ETR have a partnership with Fantasy Labs where for $30 a month you can get access to use their optimizer. It comes preloaded with our projections, our ownership projections, and you can use it to help build mass multi-entry lineups. So make sure to check out that deal with through the sign up page here. I will make sure to include that in the link when I tweet this out and promote it as well. But we're going to start with some of the different questions that I came in, and we'll start looking at the models and the lineups that I put together and some of the rules I used and different things. And I'll answer your questions in the context of how I went about doing something, or if it's something that I can't address specifically with how I did it, I'll hopefully be able to show you how to do so in the Fantasy Labs optimizer. So I've got the list of questions up here, and I'll go through those in a second. A couple things. First and foremost, I am not an employee of Fantasy Labs, so I might not know all of the tricks and ins and outs of the best ways to go about using the optimizer, but as somebody who has used optimizers for years in DFS and somebody who's been familiarizing themselves with the Fantasy Labs optimizer extensively in the preseason and during the course of this NFL season, I think I'll be able to help you with most of your questions. But if you have further questions, you can always reach out to their support as well. Secondly, I got a lot of different types of questions, and so I'm going to kind of sort this out into two screencasts. This one is going to be primarily focused on basically ways to understand and use the different tools and levers available to you through an optimizer. And then the second one we'll do separately is going to be a little bit more strategy based. The strategy one we'll put behind the paywall at Establish the Run. So if you're really interested in that one, make sure to check us out at Establish the Run. We'll put it up there. This one will be free for everyone to view so they can hopefully improve their ability to use optimizers. So let's kind of start with just looking at my week 5 lineup situation. I ended up creating, this is DraftKings. I created 430 lineups on DraftKings. Some people ask, oh, why do you have 430 lineups when you can only max enter 150 lineups in a contest? It's because I play a number of contests, as you can see here after I uploaded my entries, where I have multiple lineups. So I have 150 in the slant, I had 150 in this Pinkham charity contest, I had 20 in this 20 max, I had 50 in the milli, so on and so forth. And I choose to make a bunch of lineups and then spread them out by the contests. And some people will say, oh, do you specifically create lineups for specific contests? You certainly can do that. I don't particularly go about it that way unless I have a really off the wall take that I want to implement in a specific contest that's very top heavy. But what I do is I make the number of lineups that I need, and then I randomly assign them to the contest. And I do that simply by when I export my lineups from Fantasy Labs. So if I was to download these lineups here, and you can see throughout the day I ended up creating many more sets of 430. What I would do at the very end of the slate is I would download these lineups, and then I would simply create a randomizer in Excel, which I'll show you here how to do really quickly. And I would then paste these over my contest entries on DraftKings and then re-upload them. So this process takes a little bit longer while recording the stream to actually get Excel to open up. But once it does, I'll show quickly how to go through kind of the randomization process. And the reason that I'm doing so is simply because my thought process is I'd rather have more opportunities to get something that funnels up to the very top of a GPP, since most of these GPP prize pools have a big enough prize pool at the top that if I win that contest, I will have a winning and a profitable week. And so as a result, I'd like to give myself more lineups that I could possibly hit the nuts and give myself a chance. And if my best lineup ends up in the contest with the smallest amount of dollars to the top, so be it. That's going to happen sometimes. I'm opening up the possibility that I have the winning Millie Maker lineup and it's not in the Millie Maker. And I'm okay with that. I'm accepting that risk because I know over the course of time, this gives me more shots at potentially winning GPPs. So I'll get these lineups. They've been created and optimized in projection order from labs, and then I will just equal rand, which gives me a random number assignment. Sorry, equal rand 2, close parentheses, not 0 there, and then that'll give me a number. I drag that formula down to all the lineups that I have and give everyone a randomized number, and then I simply resort based on the randomized number, which you just paste special over the formula so it's not constantly re-randomizing over and over again. And that's how I order my lineups, and I just paste them over my contest entry. So it's not super thoughtful in terms of the approach. My idea is to take some of the choice and the selection out of it, because the idea for me is I'm creating so many good lineups in general that I don't know necessarily which one is the very best one, right? And I'm accepting some of the variance that goes alongside with contest selection. And I'm doing this because generally most of the contests that I'm entering these into are within the same stratosphere of price point and entry. And so generally I'm not, taking on too much variance in terms of the contest selection. If I play higher stakes contests, I will hand build those lineups and kind of enter them individually. But I just want to show that process because I did get a lot of questions on that. So going through kind of some of the settings that I used during the course of week 5, we'll review them quickly, and then we'll get into some of your guys' questions, and hopefully I can answer and highlight some of the things that I did to attack the problems that you guys might be facing. So I'll look at the settings that I had here that I have saved from Fantasy Labs, and this is for week 5 that I was able to use. And so you'll see my general settings here. I had positional limits, exposure caps on everything but running back. I'm fine being more concentrated at running back, and especially this week on DraftKings, I felt like it was tough to find running back plays that weren't clearly identified correctly, in my opinion, as the chalk that I really liked. And then I spread my exposure a little bit more at wide receiver, tight end, and defense. Those positions have higher levels of volatility and range of outcomes, which is a metric that you can use on labs and you can assign it. But generally, those positions have those things associated with them, and I try to work that way. I used a max ownership percentage per lineup of 145. I allowed one player versus my defense, and I did allow all the positions in flex. Now, if you didn't watch my first screencast on this, one of the things that I'll note is some of these things will change week to week. 145 is a number I derived after running kind of unconstrained lineups, having no max ownership percentage, and seeing what I got. And essentially what I felt like when I was running those lineups is I was getting too much chalk in one lineup, and I wanted to keep working it down. And so I run lots of sets during the course of the week to kind of figure these things out and work through them. Some weeks I won't allow a tight end in flex. Some weeks I will. Some weeks I'll allow a tight end in flex, and then I'll create a group that makes sure that if it's a tight end that I'm including in flex, it's a tight end that I feel like has a big ceiling. It all depends on the nature of the slate and how many good plays there are at different positions and how the salary structure is. And so it's very difficult to give cookie cutter instructions to play each and every slate. This slate I used one unique per lineup. Some slates I'll use 2 or even 3. It depends on the breadth of the plays that there are. And so one of the things that I really want to hit home and take away is that a lot of people who consume content around optimizers or ask questions around optimizers, they ask for these specific inputs as if this is a code cracking machine that if you have the specific inputs, once you hit optimized lineups, it prints money. That's not how any of this works. And really the goal of the content that I'm creating is to help educate you so you understand the levers that you're choosing and how they impact the lineups that are kind of spitting out. All right, so Just to run through these quickly, one unique player means that every lineup has at least one player that's different. In a sport like NFL, where there's a lot of players on a given slate that could potentially be good plays, sometimes I'll use 2 or even 3. 3 is about as high as I go, but I will do that to be able to spread out some of the exposures. This slate in particular, I felt was condensed. We lost 2 games due to COVID, so I had a shorter number on that. Range of outcomes is simply the range of projection distribution that the optimizer will choose from when making a lineup. So for example, if let's say a player was projected at 10 points and he was a quarterback, right? A 20% range of outcomes means the optimizer is going to choose a number between 8 and 12 points, 20% above and 20% below the player's projection each and every time that it's creating a lineup. It's going to do that with the running back. I chose 35% here, but you can choose whatever numbers that you want. And the idea for that is by choosing and implementing more range of outcomes or volatility or whatever the thing is in the optimizer tool that you use that is representing this range of outcomes distribution, is that it helps spread out and declump some of the players that get together. Because when you're using an optimizer, if you use 0 range of outcomes, if you use 0 max exposures, if you use no stacking rules or whatever, what you'd see is the number, if you create 100 lineups, you might get 100% exposure to a single player, and your next player might be in 90% of those lineups, and 80%. And the reason is because it's an optimizer. It is choosing the highest projected plays, and if you've given it no constraints, what we call vanilla optimals, no constraints, no rules, it's just going to keep choosing them over and over again. But if you create rules to make it a broader selection of options, whether it's number of players different per lineup, whether it's range of outcomes, whether it's max exposure, whether it's different rules, now you're creating a different framework for the optimizer to choose from. And it's still choosing the highest projected players, but it's choosing it from a new framework, a framework that has more constructs and rules that it has to follow. And that's why these rules and different things can help spread out some of your exposure if you want it spread out. It can help concentrate it if you want it concentrated. And that's why I say the numbers associated with these all should correlate to what you're trying to accomplish in your lineups each and every week, okay? So for me, the way that I was trying to make my lineups this week, and here are some of my bigger positional rules, is I wanted my quarterback to be paired with at least one wide receiver and tight end from the same team. I wanted certain quarterbacks to be paired with 2 wide receivers, tight ends, and I would allow a running back from the same team. And then I named the teams that I wanted, those 2. So if I was going to use Matt Ryan, I wanted 2 players with him. Teddy Bridgewater, 2 players. Dak Prescott, 2. Mahomes, 2. Jared Goff, who I ended up not including in my player pool, 2. But if I used Kyler Murray, it was okay with 1. If I used Lamar Jackson, it was okay with 1 because they're not included in here, right? Any quarterback that I used, I wanted to have at least 1 running back, wide receiver, tight end from the opponent in that same lineup. I wanted to limit at most 1 wide receiver, running back, or tight end from the same team unless they're in a game with my quarterback or a lineup with my quarterback or the opposing quarterback. So for example, I would allow 2 Cowboys in lineups with Daniel Jones or with Dak Prescott, but I would not allow 2 Cowboys in a lineup with Patrick Mahomes, right? So the idea there is if I'm getting into a game stack type situation or multiple players from the same team, I generally want the quarterback from that game, because once I get the quarterback from that game, he'll implement these other rules, and now I've got kind of natural game stacks built in, right? So that's my approach. That's how I ensure correlation in my lineups. I wanted my defense paired with exactly 0 quarterbacks from the same team. I wanted my defense with exactly 0 running back, quarterback, or tight ends from the opponent. If you remember, I had a rule that said 1 player versus opposing defense. On DraftKings, a site that has full PPR, has bonuses for reception yards. I don't mind taking a wide receiver against my defense, but I don't want players who are touchdown dependent like quarterbacks or running backs and tight ends. And so I grouped that out with a rule like that. I wanted to limit at most 1 running back from the same team. I didn't want 2 running backs from the same team. Some people will do same game. I personally do same team. I wanted to limit at most 2 running back, wide receiver, tight end from the same team in general. And you'll notice this one isn't checked, this one is. What is the difference? In this one, I'm saying if the quarterback is not from the same game, I want the limit to be 1. This is saying if the quarterback is in general in any game, I want the limit to be 2. So by doing that, what I'm saying is I want at most 2 running back, wide receiver, tight end from the same team. I don't want 3. And so I'm preventing lineups where I have triple stacks with the quarterback or triple stacks with the opposing quarterback. And that was my way to personally do that. I know my show co-host on the Establish the Million show, Mike Leone, had a lineup that had Brandon Cooks, Darren Fells, Will Fuller with Deshaun Watson that ended up finishing top 5 in luxury bucks this week. I'm playing larger contests, and in larger contests, you have to be closer to a little bit perfect, so it's harder to get a triple stack that kind of hits. And so I try to limit it to a double stack when I'm going into those. Then I had some player correlation things like if the lineup doesn't include Dak Prescott, I want to increase Ezekiel Elliott's projection by a few points. If the lineup doesn't include Deshaun Watson, I want to increase David Johnson. And if the lineup did include Deshaun Watson, I wanted to decrease David Johnson. Now, I could make a rule that says if Deshaun Watson don't include David Johnson, or if Dak Prescott don't include Ezekiel Elliott, which is one that I did. But sometimes I don't want the rule, I just want it limited a little bit. And as a result, I'll use these player correlations to do so. In order to get some contrarian lineups built, I make sure that I have at least one player I did under 8% this week. And what I do for that is I will look at the player pool, and I did 2 players under 12%. But what I'll do is I'll look at the player pool and I'll see like the number of players that I'm looking at investing in on a given week and just see kind of where their ownership is on the low end. Because if I only have a few players in my player pool that are projected for ownership that's below 5%, then if I make a rule that says I need to have at least one player that's below 5% owned, I'll get a slew of that one player. And I'll get overly concentrated in like my one contrarian player. So I generally look at kind of my flex position here, which I'm trying to sort by. Sorry, so all this stuff goes a little bit slower when I'm recording on the screencast. But I'll look at the players' projected ownerships and kind of scroll through my pool and see, okay, like do I have a lot of players below 5%? And some of these players you can see I unchecked. I decided not to include them in my pool. And as a result, I decided 5 to 8. Since we do ranges on projected ownership, I decided I wanted under 8. And I would get some of these guys guaranteed in the lineup. And then I did 2 under 12. And you can see that's correlated to kind of the ranges that Adam uses for his ownership projections. So that's my general approach this week. You can see, the way my lineup shook out. It's a lot of, as you go through, you can see it's always stacks with bringbacks, Deshaun Watson here with David Johnson and Brandon Cooks, so I did allow some David Johnson in those. You can see a bigger out game stack here with Dak and Amari and Lamb and Ingram and Slayton. And all these lineups have a little bit of correlation to them, or a big main correlation to them, and then sometimes, depending on the week, I'll try to increase secondary correlations through those player correlation settings. But that's the overview for me, so let's check in on some of your guys' questions, which we'll go to here. First question from Cody Main. Cody actually covers all of our Showdown content, does an incredible job with all of that. Make sure to check his Showdown content out over at Establish the Run. You can follow him on Twitter at CMain7. He said, is there a rule I can set to avoid all the Adam Troutman? And this is, look back to the previous week where Adam Troutman airballed at decent ownership from the tight end spot, was one of these cheaper guys that was pretty fragile on a slate. And he said, but seriously, are there better ways to avoid bad tournament plays aside from increasing range of outcomes and or setting max ownership limits? One thing that I'll note is increasing the range of outcomes won't necessarily get you less of a player. Oftentimes it will get you more of a player because you're giving more chances for their upsides to kind of get into the lineups. So the ways that I go about limiting players that I think are going to be very, very chalky in general is either through the max ownership constraint is one way you can do it. You can also do it through kind of the custom rules where you could say, I do it where I try to make sure I have lineups that are at least this, and this is ensuring getting low owned guys in. But you could make a lineup that says at most one player with projected ownership greater than 20%. You could do something like that, and that would make sure of that rule. For me, the guy that really worked that way this week was Zacchaeus, the min-priced wide receiver option for Atlanta without Julio Jones. And you can see in terms of Zacchaeus, the way that I kind of managed the ownership this week, I ended up with 18%. We were projecting 26 to 30, is essentially that I just capped his ownership. And I capped his ownership like I cap all the wide receiver ownerships, basically through a general rule that has a limit in terms of the ownership that I would have, which was 19%. You can always make an individual rule for the player too and say, I don't want more than 10% of this guy or whatever it is. And I think that's a good approach in GPPs. He ended up being close to like 35, 36%. So I was like half the field on him. And that's a stance that I'm okay with on a guy that is so cheap that he could really break the slate in a way that if I'm underexposed, I'm totally dead. And again, that gets to kind of how do you want to play? Do you want to play super aggressive? Do you want to play? My position is generally kind of like taking smaller edges and extracting them over a larger sample of lineups. So I didn't take a big position against Zacchaeus. If he had come in at 25, I would have been slightly underweight. If he had come in at 15, I would have been slightly overweight. I think of it as like, how much of this player do I want? And then let the field, kind of decide how overweight or underweight I am on that situation. So good question, Cody. Thank you for chiming in. There's a number of different ways that you can try to tackle limiting your exposure to a chalky play that you think might be fragile. J.R. Moody wrote in, Showdown MME, I wanted at least one QB in every lineup. I made a rule in position settings in the optimizer, limit to at least one QB from the same game. I get lineups when Brady is captain having Foles in there every time. Try not to have that every time, obviously. I'll ask Labs too. So J.R. Moody, the thing with Showdown and captain spots and different things like that is the way the optimizers have to code things is in a way that captain is its own unique position. So even though we know that Tom Brady and Nick Foles are a quarterback, the optimizers don't know that when they're captains. They just know that they're captains. and it's a way to have to make all the programming work on these things. So it's a little bit convoluted, but if you were to do something like that, and I think I've got this Chargers New Orleans game set up tonight now, what you could do is pair captain QB with exactly 0 other QBs. So I don't know why this didn't take. Right? And then you could make a rule that says pair QB with exactly 0 QB. Right? And since you don't need, in this one, you can do same game. Or opponent, same team obviously wouldn't help you with that situation. But that's the way you can kind of create that rule. And the big thing to understand there is just because of the programming, captains are kind of their own position, and so it doesn't recognize that it's necessarily a captain quarterback until you make a rule specifically for that. Okay. So the next question we had was, how can I add correlation beyond my stacks? I tried adding groups that could boost, say, Cowboys receivers if playing an opponent, running back, wide receiver, tight end by 15%, but it didn't do much, played with higher percentages, and didn't notice a big difference. So that's a good question, and the way you went about doing so is honestly the right way to try to do it. So the idea here is, if your primary stack is the quarterback and the wide receivers and the bring back, right? That's going to fill out a certain piece of your lineup. The idea is in those other positions, the positions that are left over from that stack, how do I get those to be somewhat correlated as well? And it's tricky. It's not the easiest thing to do in the world. The thing that I would say is those settings that you tried to tackle were the ones where you can move the needle a bit, and it's in this player correlations area. And so if we did that this week with, let's say, the Giants game, so you would do lineups that include Ezekiel Elliott, right? We're going to add a rule, and we're going to boost or increase the projection of Slayton in Ingram, in Tate, and let's say we increase it by 15% or 20% or whatever. The thing about this is you need to play with it. So the tips that I can give you is, first and foremost, try to make the correlations off the player that is already going to be in the lineups most frequently, right? Like if you make these rules with Golden Tate and you're getting like 3% Golden Tate exposure naturally, you're not really juicing your lineup set at all. So start with the players that are going to be owned the most in those games, and then boost the players that are alongside them. That's the way to kind of get some of that increased secondary correlations in your lineup. The other question was, how do you get less tight end wide receiver in the flex? When I select running back, tight end, wide receiver eligible, I get super high wide receiver tight end rates. Adam's offseason article says that's high. That he's referencing the article that Adam Levitan and Mike Leone worked on together in tandem on Millie Maker trends historically and kind of what winning lineups have looked like in different things. And then he said, how do you get some quarterback running back correlation, but not too much? And again, the question relates to Adam's article. And the running back correlation one is one that I tackle here, right? And how I think about running back quarterback correlation is, if the running back and the quarterback are high priced and high owned, I almost always play them independently and don't play them together. And so that was the case that I thought would be the case with Dak and Zeke. Dak ended up lesser owned than I kind of thought in some contests, but I make sure that I break them out. I could have maybe done this with Patrick Mahomes and Clyde Edwards-Helaire this week, but I still kind of expect Edwards-Helaire to have such a receiving impact that I left it in. That's one that, looking back on it with Mahomes and Clyde Edwards-Helaire's ownership, I might have done differently if I could do it again. Other quarterbacks that I used this week, like Lamar Jackson, I didn't have to worry about that rule because it wasn't something that was going to come up, but I would not use a running back alongside Lamar Jackson. I would not use a running back alongside Kyler Murray. Guys that just aren't throwing to their running backs enough, I exclude them entirely. Now, David Johnson with Deshaun Watson. Johnson was cheap enough, and I thought modestly owned enough, that I was going to use him in some Deshaun Watson lineups, but not all. And because running backs generally have a little bit stronger projections than wide receivers, if you don't do something to knock them down, you'll get a lot of the quarterback with the running back together. And so what I did here was I decreased David Johnson's ownership in lineups with Deshaun Watson, and I increased it in lineups without Deshaun Watson. And that basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say I want David Johnson ownership, but I'd like it separated from Deshaun Watson. And I don't want to make a rule that purely eliminates it altogether. So that's how I kind of go about doing that. How do I get less tight end and wide receiver in the flex? That one is interesting. I actually don't, I don't track my flex ownership. It's not something that I'm actively kind of looking at on a given week. But one of the ways that I try to think about my overall ownerships in my lineups, and you can see a lot of these lineups, we've got wide receiver, running back, and again, I haven't I don't do a check on my own lineups to see what I'm getting. You get a tight end here, you get a running back here, you get a wide receiver there. But what I try to think of is if I manage the overall exposure to the position by using positional restrictions on ownership, then I can somewhat finagle the flex lineup ownership. And so that's kind of my approach to these things. And apologies, my stream software just slows down everything when I'm trying to do this. But that's how I think about it. So I essentially will cap my wide receivers around like 20%, but I'll let my running backs get up to 30, 40, 50% in cases. And you can see as you're kind of going through the flex here, I'm getting some tight ends, I'm getting some running backs at flex, I'm getting a mix of these options. It also, for me, depends on each week with how the player pool looks. Like this week in particular, there were a few running backs that were very strong, but I didn't think the depth of the running back position was particularly strong. I actually didn't think the depth of the wide receiver position was super strong this week, which is why I allowed tight ends in flex. And you can see a lot of these lineups do have kind of double tight ends, ones that I thought had enough upside to potentially contend in tournaments. It didn't work out for me. I didn't have a particularly good week in MME, but it just kind of goes to show that, there's each week is kind of a different approach, and you have to approach each week uniquely. But kind of scrolling through all these, it looks to me like I have a pretty good balance between running back and tight end and wide receiver kind of in the flex spot here. So I think, maybe my overall caps on the positions where I limit my individual tight ends to, 18 to 20. I think this week I went up to 22, 23 because I thought they were a little bit better. And I limit my individual wide receiver ownerships to like 18, 19 because I thought the wide receiver position was a little bit weaker. Some weeks I'll get up to like 22, 23 on that. I think that's a way that you can help kind of control your flex ownership overall. Those were all the questions that, we have some others. I'm sorry, I didn't scroll all the way down. For running QBs with pair of at least one wide receiver tight end from same team, optimizers normally only give one and hardly spit out two. And what he's saying is, Chris G, Gravy Cakes DFS, thank you for the question. What Chris is saying is, when you get these running quarterbacks, a lot of times because so much of the projection is built up in their rushing, you don't get them double stacked as frequently. How do I get these guys double stacked more frequently? And this is where you can use the player correlations as well. So you're not making a rule that they always have to be double stacked, but you can say lineups that include Kyler, right? Because he's a good one. He's a guy that is always going to have a good projection with Nuke, but the secondary guys are going to have a tougher projection. Christian Kirk, Larry Fitzgerald, so on and so forth. You can just boost their projection by basically saying, when I have a lineup with Kyler Murray, I want to increase the projection of Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald. And I just did 25% as an example, but you can take that up and you can kind of play with it and see what your lineups look like. And really what a lot of this stuff comes down to is rerunning the optimizer a lot of times and playing with it and getting different looks at what you're looking at. Sorry, I keep going back to that contest dashboard. It's such a cool dashboard that Labs has. I was looking at my slant entries and I was looking at, like, Zacchaeus was that Troutman question. I was 10% under the field. He ended up 28% in that. While my biggest overweight position on the field was Brandon Cooks at 11% overweight. And Cam Akers, which I talked about on the Establish the Million show, was a player that I thought would be 0 to 1% owned and I was going to take a shot on. And Hardman, another, way at the Chiefs. I was overweight the Chiefs a lot on this slate in general. Other question from Chris. In at least one running back, tight end, wide receiver of opposing team rules with quarterback, optimals always seem to spit out a ton of opposing running backs, generally due to projections. Any ways to combat this, spread this out? So again, you can always check on your lineups at the end. It's not something I check for, but one of the ways I think I naturally get this spread out is through some of the overall rules. And if I'm overall allowing more ownership to running backs than wide receiver or tight end, I might get a lot more running backs if the running back is valued as a good play. But if the running back from that game isn't valued as a good play, me allowing higher percentage is going to push down the ownership over those secondary guys. So for example, I'm trying to think through like a good example of this. Like, I didn't have Devonta Freeman as a good value yesterday in our projections. And so even on my DAX stacks, I wasn't getting Freeman very much because I allowed a lot of positions I allowed a lot of ownership to go to my stronger running backs, the Mike Davis, the Ezekiel Elliott, so on and so forth. In addition, if you increase the volatility, the range of outcomes on wide receivers and tight ends compared to your running back position, you take that a little bit lower, you'll get a little bit more wide receiver, tight end overall into your player pool, and then you just cap it with the individual player so that you're getting more exposure to the more volatile position, but less exposure to an individual player. It's getting less concentrated. And I think that's the way you can go about it. That might be directly contradictory to the previous question about how do I get fewer tight end wide receivers in flex. And so that's why you just need to play with the settings that are tackling what you're trying to accommodate. And that's why I always say, like, my settings aren't necessarily the right settings for you. If you're trying to get a lot of running backs in flex, you might want to up the volatility or the range of outcomes on the running backs and lower the ownership caps on the other positions and keep the cap really high on running backs. If you're trying to get more wide receivers and tight ends in flex, you might want to lower the range of outcomes on running backs and inflate the range of outcomes on wide receivers and tight ends. Or you can always just make a rule too, if you want. Like one of the other things you can do with the optimizer is you can run lineups with different rules, right? So like, let's say I'll do 100, well, I'll do 10 for now because this will probably run slow. I'll do 10 lineups with these rules where I'm allowing a running back in as the bring back in the flex. And you can see we've now got Tennessee Buffalo back in this schedule because of the challenges everybody's having with tech during this time of COVID games moving around all the time. But in general, this gives me some Deshaun Watson with James Robinson. Let's say I run this and I'm like, okay, I have 10 lineups. I need to create 100 lineups in total. I can add more lineups, but then change the settings. So now I make it so that for these next 10 lineups that I'm going to do, I'll have this rule where the bring back can only be a wide receiver or a tight end, right? And I apply the settings, and now I run 10 more lineups. And in these next 10 lineups, I'm not going to get a running back as the bring back. And you can kind of control and manipulate your exposure through the entire lineup set through looking at these lineups as a whole, and just kind of finagling with the add more button the different rules that you want to do. That's another one of the ways and one of the tricks of using an optimizer where you can create lots of lineups and kind of implement different rules along the way while you're going about it. So this has already been 35 minutes, pretty long video on one that was supposed to be short, which is basically my MO. I tend to overanalyze some of these situations, but hopefully gave you guys some good insight on how to tackle things. The last question that we got, oh no, there's more. There's so many questions. Okay, I'll tackle a few more of these real quick. No lifestyle questions. What's your skincare routine? As a DFS player, my skincare routine is avoiding the sun, staying inside, and making lots of lineups. I set min-max for players, but the optimizer often doesn't kick out every one of those players. I start with 100 lineups and broad parameters with low percentage cap, requiring at least 2 different players per lineup. Is there something I'm overlooking to why the min percentage gets ignored? The min percentage is a total enemy of an optimizer. It slows it down. It takes away from optimization. It's just it's a feature that people like to use, but they don't understand how much of a drag it puts on the optimizer. Because if I can cap players with the max ownership, what it's saying is once I hit this cap, stop making lineups, just remove them from the pool. But when I'm minning players, it's saying put all these players in, then put them, then use a different number of players in each lineup, and it just screws everything up. I don't recommend using min caps. If you're using min caps, maybe use it on a player or two. But if you go through and make like 20 players with a min cap and 20 players with a max cap, you're over constraining the optimizer. It's going to have to ignore rules to create enough lineups. Some optimizers will just stop creating the lineups. Others will finish creating the lineups and ignore the rules. And at that point, you've over constrained things to where you're not getting the results that you're going to like. So I really recommend avoiding the min exposure setting and using it very sparingly. What about player pool numbers per week, week to week? I get this question often. I never consider it. It's not something I ever consider. I'm not trying to get to a specific number. I will limit my player pool, as you can see. Like basically how I start each week is I choose which quarterbacks I want to use. And then after a couple runs, I might have to like fire emoji guys or bunt their projection to get them to the ownership that I'm looking to target. But that's me manipulating the system. So this was the quarterback options that I chose from. Obviously not the Tennessee Buffalo games; those guys were out. And then like Kyle Allen, someone I thought was super fragile, I just put a max cap on, and then I work from there. But my thought process isn't each week. Who are the 5 quarterbacks I'm going to play? Each week is different. This week I had like probably 10 or 11 quarterbacks in my pool. Other weeks I might have 4. It's just different on what I'm trying to accomplish on a given week. So I'm never thinking about a specific number is the right number to have in my player pool. I don't even know. I don't even know how many players I end up with each and every week in my player pool. I understand some people work that way. I do not. It's not something I care about at all. How can you best correlate players not included in the lineup's primary game stack? For example, I wanted Mixon in some lineups where the primary stack was Seattle, Miami, and it was not putting shark or coal as correlating pieces in the flex. So I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but any of the player correlation stuff, if you want mix-in with a specific game stack, run a set of lineups through that add more feature that has a player correlation rule to add in. Or if you just want a certain number of lineups that way, run 20 lineups that way. If you say, I want 20 lineups of a Seattle-Miami game stack with mix-in, basically run 20 lineups where your only 2 available quarterbacks, uncheck all the quarterbacks but Fitz and Russell Wilson, and then lock mix-in. Do stuff like that and use the add more, and then take some of the rules off and add more. And with labs, you can tag the lineups however you want. So you can tag 20 lineups as Seattle-Miami with mix-in. Add tag, save the lineups, boom. You've got them for whenever you want to add them into a lineup set. Those are things that you can do where if you want to be very specific about how you're handling an individual lineup decision, but you don't want it necessarily prevalent through the entire lineup set, you need to use that add more feature. How can I make it more likely to correlate my secondary stacks with full and skinny QB stacks? This is basically the same question as before and the same idea. Use the player correlations, and you can put those rules on and take them off and run them for sets of the lineups that you're looking to utilize. You just save those lineups. I've created 20 lineups here, right? So I'll save these as DK example. I'll add that tag. I'll save those lineups. And then when I go to my lineups that I've created on labs, I now have lineups with different tags that I can include or choose to not include when I'm downloading my lineups for the final decision. So here's in total with these 20, I have over 1,700 unique lineups on the different iterations of sets that I ran on Sunday, and now these 20 here on Monday afterwards. But they're all labeled differently, and some of the lineups come up in each, some of the lineups are common, so they come up in each different tag and they're included in those tags. But when I go to download the lineups, I can choose which tag I want to download and which set I want to include, and then I can apply those to specific contests. And so, if you did that example with mix-in with Seattle, or if you did an example where you correlated your secondary stacks more specifically with the stack that you're trying to make, you can just download that set individually and apply it, which is a really cool feature. So use the add more function, take rules on and off to adjust during the course of the lineup creation process, and hopefully you can create the types of lineup sets that you want on the whole, because that's the whole thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to teach you that the optimizer is a tool to try to get your thoughts onto paper. It's not a tool that is a lotto machine spitting out the winning numbers. It's a tool to take what's in your head and get it into your lineups. And there's lots of different tools and levers that you can pull to get those thoughts that you have into your actual lineups. So that'll do it for this screencast edition. A little bit of a week 5 review along with a Q&A section for you guys. We're going to have this free for everybody to be able to view. We will be doing some premium screencasts as well that talk through a little bit more strategy stuff as well. So make sure to head over to Establish the Run and get your in-season pass if you don't have it already, so you can view those premium screencasts as well. But that'll do it. That's it for me, Drew Dinkmeyer from Establish the Run. Best of luck out there, everyone, in week 6 and beyond.